Okay, all right. I'm gonna get ready to open it up. You guys ready?
Sure.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started right here on time. Let's see. Looks like we have some people coming in. All right. So we are very excited to have a guest speaker here with us today, Danielle Mundekis. Danielle was born and raised in New York City. After graduating from Oberlin College, she became an admissions associate director for admissions for the Ethical Cultural Fieldstone School. In 2013, she relocated to Pittsburgh to work for Shady Side Academy in the president's office, where she helped develop and hone numerous practices and policies with an emphasis on human resources. In addition to speaking, training, and consulting for organizations across the Northeast, Danielle is the Employee Relations and Inclusion Manager for Eckert Seamans, Sharon and Mellett, where she is responsible for the diversity, equity, and inclusion programming and implementation for all of the firm's 11 offices. Danielle holds certificates in diversity and inclusion and advanced diversity inclusion from Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. She's also a certified human resources professional through the Society for Human Resource Management. And as of July 2021, will earn her certification from Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations to serve as a certified diversity practitioner. Danielle has served on the board of directors for the Pittsburgh Human Resources Department and was chair of their Learning and Professional Development Committee, a role that was responsible for the implementation of training and learning opportunities for over 1,200 members of the greater Pittsburgh area. She continues to serve as the PHRA as a member of Membership, Diversity, and College Relations Committee and serves as an advisory board member for Disrupt HR Pittsburgh. So thanks again for being with us, Danielle. We're really looking forward to your presentation. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Danny, for having me, and to everyone who's joining today. It's so great to be here with you all. So thank you. I appreciate that. That was a mouthful. We are just going to get started talking today a little bit about what it is to have a personal brand, what that might mean, and just kind of get to know each other a little bit. I'll probably share some anecdotes. Hope I don't bore anybody too much. And Danny is going to chip in and make sure that we are dialoguing back and forth. All right. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is just simply, what is a personal brand, right? So what is it? Where does it exist? What does it look like across industries? How do demographics play a role in what your personal brand might look like? And then what does the evolution of that brand look like in the marketplace, the workplace, and the workforce, right? And so when we're thinking about a personal brand, it's really sort of your, whether it's visual or social media or in writing, right? But like your elevator pitch of who you are, a quick sort of visual synopsis of who you are as an individual. And sometimes it's how people decide they might want to hire you, right? It can be how they decide that they want to interact with you. And it can also tell them, depending on your industry, a little bit about who you are within that space, right? So that's really sort of the crux of what your personal brand is and how you're going to use it. We're going to take a look at a couple of these folks that I have on this screen here. Bear with me as I share for a second. And I'm definitely one of those people who has 1,000 icons. So know that in advance as you get this window into my desktop.
I'm right there with you. No judgment here.
All right. So our first person who we are going to take a look at is Bradley M. Grayton, right? And he is the GC for Coca-Cola. He's been making waves lately for some of the policies that he is implementing in the workplace, right? And when we look at Bradley's sort of social media presence, this is both his Twitter and his Instagram, his photos. His imaging is pretty consistent, right? We can see that he's kind of doing the glasses bow tie thing. That's sort of his shtick, who he is, right? Or at least who he wants us to see. And if we take a look at some of the types of things that he is posting, and bear with me as I try to move around my screen. Okay, this is from an interview that he did, right? So he's letting us in on a very specific image. What's your job? He's very sort of technical, right? How'd you end up at Ford? This is right before he was at Coke, right? If we look at some of these questions, even, I think they ask him somewhere on here, do you monogram your shirts, right? Those are the kinds of things that he's interested in letting folks in on personally when he's commenting in the media or press, right? If we took a look at his Twitter, which I think is actually, the link is here, but knowing technology, I'm not going to push that and try and make it work right now. If we take a look at his Twitter, you'll see that his posts, while he certainly comments on social justice initiatives, which is a large part of what he's sort of made prominent at Coke in recent months, it's very work related, right? He's never really commenting from a personal place of opinion. He's never really commenting from a place of I as an individual feel this. It's I in my role think that this is what we should be doing, right? So his image is really curated. He's really, really careful about how he's posting and what he's posting in sort of the public space. Then we look at someone like Jamila Jamil, right? She's an activist, actress, radio presenter. If you look at her Twitter, while she sometimes occupies similar spaces and is in sort of a more serious entertainment segment sometimes, she's also, you know, known for shows like The Good Place and really sort of funny anecdotal moments as well. Her information tends to be much more anecdotal. It's much more personal, right? You're hearing at least what she wants you to think is much more sort of in tune with who she is as a person rather than in her role with any particular organization or as part of any show, right? Then we've got Frank Del Rio. He's the CEO of Norwegian Cruise Line. And if we were to look at his social media presence, pretty much the photo that I'm showing you right here is his social media presence, right? He really doesn't exist as sort of his own individual autonomous being in, you know, sort of a social media or even a media space, really outside of Norwegian Cruise Line, right? He is the brand. That is how he identifies personally. You're not going to see anything necessarily from Frank. You'll see something from Norwegian. And then we look at Chrissy Teigen, right? I think most folks know who Chrissy Teigen is and what she does. But if you were to look at Chrissy's Instagram, right, her website, her YouTube, for example, they're all super personal. And again, all these spaces are curated, right? Folks are only going to let you see what they want to see, right? That's really the point of social media. Well, you'll find that as you look at hers in particular, it feels much more approachable, much more personal, right? It feels like she's really letting you in to who she might be as a person, as an individual. So each of those four folks have very different approaches to social media, to their brand, and to how they present, right? And so just taking a look, sort of, as I stop sharing really quickly, my apologies, taking a look at how they occupy each of their spaces is something to think about as we continue this conversation. Bear with me 1 second. All right. So what we're going to move into a little bit today is talking about defining your brand, right? What does that look like? What is your personal brand? What should that look like? And Danny, I think you've got some questions. I'm not sure if you want to pop any of them out there and we can start going back and forth a little bit.
Yeah, definitely, Danielle. So I love the examples that you just shared with us in terms of kind of how people put themselves out there in the world. And one question that I have on here is thinking about your personal brand versus how that lines up with who you really are. So, you know, you mentioned that in Chrissy Teigen's example for, you know, that space is curated and, you know, they're kind of putting out what they want you to see. So would you say that some of that may be inauthentic, or like how would you really define the difference between the brand and who the person is?
I think that's going to vary really greatly from person to person, organization to organization, right? So in a space where you maybe have a little bit more liberty, right, to present who you want to the world, maybe you're self-employed, or, you know, you are an actor and actress where you've got a lot more leeway to say, you know, the kinds of things that you want to say and still, you know, be hired without any sort of repercussion. You tend to find that folks, the image that they curate in those spaces sometimes is a little bit, I'm sure it's just as carefully constructed, but the feeling of being let in is a lot greater, right? Because there's a different sort of loss at stake for them when they overshare, right? In that sense, no, what is that saying? It's no press is bad press, right? So there's a different sense of awareness, I think, about who you can be and who you can share with the world. Now, in terms of being authentic or inauthentic as a person in that space, right? I think that is sort of where we get into the conversation, especially if we're not talking about a career that has as much flexibility maybe as Chrissy Teigen, right? But that's where we start to get into the conversation of code switching, right? And what that might look like. Who are you really versus who do you like to present in a space? And code switching technically is linguistic, right? It really sort of originates back to language, but culture has become a language, right? And so we want to think about that when we're talking about code switching. And when you're being authentic, when you're curating an image that you're going to share with the world, I think it's really important to also contextualize that what you're really doing, if you have to do it, or if you feel like you want to present something maybe different, maybe not your whole self, right, is a code shift and not a code switch. Because a code switch is exhausting. To completely be somebody different, to be a whole different person at work, at school, than you are at home with your family, with your friends, that will break you down, right? And we want to make sure that that's not the extent we're going to. Maybe it's just a minor shift, you know what I mean? Maybe it's that, and I'm using something very anecdotal and simple here. Maybe it's just that, you walk a little taller and a little straighter because that's what you feel that environment would be conducive to, right? But it's not a whole personality shift. You shouldn't change who you are, and more importantly, you shouldn't have to change who you are to be in an environment. Now, I will say that part of it is incumbent upon those of us who are employers to make sure that's happening for students, right? Your job as students and the job of the students who are participating in today's conversation is to keep seeking out cultures that challenge them, right? Challenge themselves to change and that welcome that sort of authenticity at work, because in seeking that, you also force the culture to change, right? So there's a level of symbiosis there, but the onus is really on the employer. It's not really about the student.
Love that. Thank you, Danielle. Appreciate that in-depth
Sure.
answer. So we actually got a question in the chat that I'll go to before I dive into any of our other questions. So this is from Glenn. He said, as a Black queer man who is vocal about their identity within the workspace and social media, how can I and others like me set our brand apart from the white supreme's SM branding?
So I want to make sure that I'm understanding the question a little bit more clearly. So Danny, tell me if you think I'm off base. I just want to make sure I'm getting it right. Okay, so the question is, as a Black queer man who's vocal about their identity within the workspace, right? How can I be that person within my workspace if it's different from the identity I'm expressing? Right?
No, I think it's more so just asking, and my interpretation is how they separate themselves from white people in the space, I guess, is my understanding of it.
Sure. And I can't see your whole name. I'm sorry. The person who asked that question, if you want to chip in and clarify too, please feel free to do that. I would appreciate it. But let's try and approach that from the angle you just said, Danny. If
Wait, hold on.
have
their hand.
Sorry?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So so something that I have found within within my classes, I'm a graduate student here at Pitt, is that when as a Black male or Black females are seen as these angry Black women within these workspaces. And as Black men, we are seen as these aggressive, mean beings. And when we're in these workspaces and have other identities. So for me as a Black queer man, I'm seen as sometimes I'm seen as this aggressive being, not within my workspace, but in a classroom, I'm being seen as this aggressive, sassy Black man. But on social media, it's a whole different platform, right? Because not only am I relating to other people outside of the Pittsburgh area, it's easy for me to simply say this is me, this is myself branding, but those who are not understanding that, looking from the outside in, are seeing something that's like, oh, that's too much, or that like that doesn't look right. And I see that happening not only just with me, but with other people as well. And that also applies to like Black organizations or queer organizations, because we have people from the outside looking in, or those within the institution are not understanding like why we are doing the things that we're doing on social media. And then like keeping it professional as is, it's just hard to understand like, how can I and other people like me simply keep our branding and not having to, like you said, codes, not necessarily code switching, but how can we like keep it one-on-one and not trying to go from 1 to 2 or 1 to 3?
Sure. So can I ask you a question too before you mute yourself? Again, do you find that when you're experiencing that sort of interpretation, right, of who you are by people who identify differently than you, in particular, that it tends to happen when you are, and I don't mean this with aggression, I just mean in general, maybe challenging an opinion or stating a difference, or in dialogue where it might feel different than what the core is going for?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think, and like, this is no shade towards the institution, but it's facts, right? Pitt is a predominantly white institution that has been run by white people since the day it was established. And whenever like people like me, from either being Black or being a person of color, being queer, when we vocalize something within a classroom, and when we vocalize something on social media, it's like, oh, but like not everyone's like that. But we have to go back on history and state that reason why. And I think that whenever I'm posting something about like if I see a news article that is sabotaging people of color or sabotaging queer, and I share that because that's my social branding. I want people to be aware of the things that are happening. And I automatically get questions like, it's not like that, or like they deserve it. When I hear things like that, it's coming from white community, or those who are showing ignorance within like not understanding certain identities or learning about certain cultures in the making.
Sure. So one of the things that sometimes can happen, and two things, right? I'll break this down 2 parts. I'm going to use the dreaded P word, right? That nobody likes to talk about, and that's privilege, right? And privilege just means that obstacles and barriers aren't necessarily there, right? It's not necessarily meant to imply any sort of inherent negativity, but often it gets construed that way, right? But sometimes when people hold privilege, or they come from positions of power or authority, right? Whatever it may be in that situation, anything that feels contrary to something that hits home to a value is automatically construed in a negative way, right? Whether it's aggression or defensiveness. And this is where we start to see those tropes being built, right? Like the angry Black woman, the aggressive Black man, right? That's where we start to see, the extra person, right? Like that's where we start to see those tropes come out, is in those moments of challenge. And so thank you for sharing that, and for being brave enough to come off of
thank you.
And share that with us. Of course, no, that's huge. And that's when we start to see that sort of persona develop, right? The way that I can relate, that I've often found it sort of the most meaningful and the most beneficial to highlight those things to people, is to relate it in a way that has nothing to do with the topic that you're talking about, right? So someone might say, you might point out, let's use your example of articles, right? And bringing it back to historical context and the way that we frame things and how we draw pictures of people in the media, right? And you might say, this is coming from a place of supremacy, and this is coming from the way that we frame really, harsh and dangerous, sometimes difficult material in the media, right? Like, how do we frame it for this group versus this other group over here? And maybe you're saying that it comes from a position of historic power, right? Or something like that. And someone automatically interprets that and says, well, not all people are that way. Not all white people are that way. Not all whoever the person is in that context, right? Not all people are that way. Sometimes the most beneficial way, like I said, to do that or to address that is to just not talk about it in the context of people anymore. And the classic example is like the M&M bowl, right? If you have a bowl of 100 M&Ms and you're hungry, and someone says to you, here's a bowl of M&Ms, right? And 5 of them are poisoned, right? The odds are that the average person is still going to eat an M&M. I mean, I'm not talking like on your deathbed starving, but just hungry. The odds are that an average person who's going to eat an M&M are slim, right? Because who would take that chance? There's enough in there to make it dangerous. Of course, you know that the whole bowl is not that way, but there's enough of a chance for something to harm you in there that you have to be cautious when approaching that bowl of candy, right? And it's kind of the same thing in that conversation. If you can draw it away from the moment that people in those positions, the sort of reflex is to take it and make it about me, right? Because they start to identify with something in what it is you're sharing an issue with in themselves. So if you could take it away from that moment of sort of self-centeredness and sometimes narcissism, depending on who you're talking to, right, and relate it to something that's really innocuous and harmful, sometimes that's a way to bring it back to a space that then makes it relatable and understandable. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And like, I think a great example of that, like, that you have shared with Chrissy Teigen, is that like her social media has always been engaged, and like she's very vocal about everything that's been going on, and she like stands up for like people of color, she stands up for like the trans community. And I think that because like it's similar to like what I have seen on like, for instance, like Facebook, like people, so if there's something going on, you can always go on Facebook to like count on someone to have like a different opinion than you and try to shut you down. And I think on Twitter itself, where Chrissy is like vocalizing these things that need to change, you have people that are like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not a politician. Like you have it easy. You're a celebrity. But even though like she has those titles, even though she has the title of a celebrity, she still feels those things. She is a person of color. She is someone that like that has like friends within different communities that she wants to support. But yet there's people out there, not in like in life, in universities, in your workspace, that are out there that's like are willing just to like tear you down because like they feel like that's not what they're seeing. But as people of color and those who are queer, those are the things that we are always looking out for.
Sure. Completely agree. And you know, it's hard. I won't profess that any of this conversation is not challenging. So I acknowledge that too.
Awesome. Well, thanks for jumping in there, Glenn, and participating. We appreciate the question and the dialogue as well. Kind of getting back to like formulating the brand, which obviously your identity is a big part of that, to Glenn's point. So what are some of the ways that students can go about building a personal brand? And, you know, do you think it's necessary for all students to have a brand? Because I know the examples that you showed, you know, they've all achieved some level of fame. Maybe easier for them to kind of formulate that brand and put it out into the world. But like just going back to the basics, what do you think they need to think about when creating one?
So I think those are all really formal examples of what a personal brand can look like, right? But the reality is that whether or not you want to have one, you do, right? And so, yes, I do think that everybody needs to be mindful of creating one, but more importantly, even if you don't have one that's, you know, sort of formalized in the way that we're acknowledging and talking about right now, you do need to realize that one exists about you, right? And part of what creating a personal brand does is allow you to steer your narrative, right? Because the person who steers the narrative is always the person who has the power, right? So you want to be mindful of that as you're thinking about what your brand is and how you're creating it. Yes, you need one. It doesn't have to be a social media presence, right? It's going to vary greatly depending on industry, depending on interest, depending on how it is you want to express yourself, right? That's a part of it. But even just who you are and how people perceive you is really sort of at the crux of what that may look like. So, you know, I think, yeah, you need to have one. You need to think about what you want it to be in terms of how to build it and when to start building it now is the answer while you're in school. This is a great sort of safe-ish practice environment to really sort of hone some of your skills. And, you know, networking is something that I'm sure everyone's been talking about all week, and what that looks like. And Danny, I said this to you when we spoke earlier this week, you know, a great way to get started, even on some of the more minor components of networking and what that looks like, is think about what your experience is like on a daily basis, right? Maybe sit next to somebody in class that you don't normally sit next to and strike up a conversation with them. See if you can get that dialogue flowing, because a big part of networking when you enter the professional space is doing just that. And a lot of times you might be really lucky and maybe be part of a really big organization that sends, you know, 5, 10, 15 people to a conference. And so maybe you have that safety net, right, of that person who you can talk to in the room when it's sort of awkward, right? And you're working on breaking the ice. But if you work for a firm like I do, usually you go by yourself. And so that means that you are, sort of the sacrificial penguin, right? Like pushed off the ice and you see if you get eaten. So that said, you have to walk up to people that you don't know and just start talking to them, just start engaging in conversation. Sometimes that doesn't mean that I'm the first one to talk. It might mean I walk up to a circle of people and observe conversation for a while, right? See what the flow is and kind of get my bearings. Other times, maybe you jump right in. But a great sort of practice area for that right now is school. There's so many opportunities to talk to people that you don't necessarily get to talk to on a daily basis, or that you don't choose to talk to, quite frankly, on a daily basis. Engage with people who are different than you. I'm not saying put yourself in harm's way, and I'm not saying that you necessarily need to engage with people who make you feel in any way, shape, or form unsafe, right? That's not what I'm getting at. But maybe there's somebody who you've never reached out to, you've never interacted with. Maybe there's a professor even that you've always wanted to get to know, and you've never thought about going to office hours, right? Those are some of the ways that you don't even realize that you're beginning to build your networking skills, which is a huge part of your personal brand and who you become as you advance in the professional space.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Danielle. Yeah, I think that's all really helpful information. I definitely agree on the networking aspect. Now, thinking about this process, it could be new in terms of just trying to establish a brand. So are there aspects that you think people should avoid or students should avoid specifically? Things not to do, anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things not to do. Try not to paint yourself into a corner, right? Leave your brand room to grow and evolve with you professionally and as you do through spaces. Be mindful of language that you use, especially now, right? Language, imagery, tropes, the way that you convey your thoughts, right? And writing is permanent, especially on the internet. So be mindful of that. Think through it, and also know that language changes, right? What is acceptable to say in 2020 looks completely different than it did in 2000, right? Some of it sure was inherently wrong, or we knew, and now it's just, maybe expressed more openly that we have an issue with it. But some of it, quite frankly, was part of regular rhetoric and has changed for the better, right? So always being mindful of those shifts in languages, being sure to note that if somebody expresses discomfort with something that you've said or done, you apologize and that you don't do it again, right? All of those kinds of things I would say are really mindful, or really important rather, to be mindful of. Because as you grow and you change and you sort of develop yourself into this person, into this image, into this projection, right, into the world that you want to be, that's constantly evolving. And so you've got to be fluid with it. So that was a little bit of a do and a little bit of a don't.
Love it. Absolutely. Now, thinking about it from an aesthetic standpoint, what role would you say imagery plays? And do you think having certain colors associated with your brand, how do you feel about all of that?
Sure. As far as colors, I would say to everybody, if you are thinking of going a more formal route, right, and you're not in marketing already, it doesn't hurt to have a basic sense of what that might look like, taking some color theory, right, understanding what colors sort of evoke what emotions in people, because sometimes with your messaging that can be really important. Sometimes it's not as important. So that's up to you to determine when you're at that point, but it helps to know. And as far as aesthetics of your own image, again, that's going to depend really on where you want to go and what specifically it is you want to be doing. I will say, I think it's really important to find a space that accepts whatever image it is that you want to project and not the other way around. Now, that's not to say, again, that we do things that are inappropriate, right? Like, sure, I might decide to wear a ball gown to a baseball game, but the odds of that are pretty low, right? There's usually a certain subset of outfit that one would think of in that kind of environment. So same here, right? Like, I'm not saying go so far left that you don't know where you belong anymore. Not in that way at all. But I would say make sure that wherever you are and whatever aesthetic it is that you're creating, you're comfortable taking up space in that aesthetic, right? And sometimes maybe that aesthetic is part of how you get comfortable taking up space. If you are a person who's maybe not, the most outgoing, or you are a little bit more shy, and you want to strike up conversation with folks and you're not sure how, right? Like maybe that's a great time for, and this sounds so superficial, but you'd be amazed at the things that are icebreakers in a professional setting, right? Like maybe that's the time for a really cool sort of funky pair of shoes or something like that. The amount of people who will come up to you and talk and comment on them, as silly as that might sound, take some of the work out of thinking about how to strike up conversation with people in that setting, right? So there are lots of ways I think that image can play into the brand that you're building. Now, again, I said, don't paint yourself into a corner. So maybe unless you want to be known as the person with the quirky shoes, that's not your icebreaker every time, right? But it has a place, it has a time, and thinking about sort of mechanisms that can help you break out of your mold if you're in one, or out of your shell, I think can be really useful and beneficial for folks.
Yeah, thank you. That's definitely some good insight. I like the shoes part. I think when we're back in person, shoes get a lot of comments. That's a good point.
They do.
Now think about that more from a messaging standpoint. So your aesthetics are obviously part of your messaging, but also the words you choose and when you use them and how you use them is also important. So kind of a two-parter here. What would you say the level of importance with messaging is? And then second part of that would be, if you don't have that network of people or you're not sure how to network it, but you want to get that messaging out there, and maybe social media, you know, like Twitter and Instagram isn't the thing for you. Like, what ways would you recommend go about getting that messaging of your brand out there?
Sure. So I'll answer that sort of all over the place. If you don't have a network, right? If you've come to school and you don't have a network, there will be no better place for you to develop one than where you are right at this very moment, right? Because what's going to happen is the folks that you are with in this space right now, sure, you're all together at this very moment in time, right? But over the years, through time, you're going to graduate and you're going to move away. Sure, some of you will stay, but some of you will move on, right? Your network starts to develop externally outside of Pittsburgh, outside of Pitt, right? As folks move away and start to be able to share your message for you elsewhere, right? So this is really sort of the crux of where you can begin to develop that sort of farther reaching net than you've currently got in your back pocket. Networks, don't happen overnight, right? They take time, because if you're going to build relationships, right? If you're really going to build partnerships with people that stand the test of time, that takes trust, right? And trust takes time. Part of spreading your message and getting it out there effectively is people believing in what you're saying and wanting to help you share that message, right? Like no man is an island. None of us is going to do this by yourself. It's going to take a team effort really to get that out there. So yeah, I would say right now is the time to start if you're not, right? Start thinking about that. And it's sometimes it's just going to be your friends. Hopefully it grows beyond that. And you know, some of the stuff we've talked about today becomes things that you start to try so that you can begin to grow that group, right? Because every person is really an advocate. And it's important to think of them that way. It's also, you know, I think this is the space too, where it's good to start to grow the idea of sponsorship. So I don't know if folks have spoken about that recently or not. Okay. In a professional space, in an academic space even, right? There is a separation between the kind of person who you look to for mentorship advice and the kind of person who you look to for sponsorship advice, right? Your mentor is going to be the person who you go to and say, I had a really bad class or had a really bad week at work and this thing's happened, help me troubleshoot it, right? Like help me figure out the way that I can make this problem no longer be a problem and turn it into a teachable moment, right? That's your mentor. That's what they're going to do. Sometimes your mentor is your sponsor, but not usually, right? And it's important also to have more than one sponsor. Your sponsor, sure, you may go to them for, you know, some of those kinds of troubleshooting moments sometimes, but really their goal is to be your advocate. Your sponsor is the person who, when you're not in the room, is going to advocate for why you should be, right? That's the person who's going to say, you know, Danielle is really great at X, Y, and Z project. And I think that when we do the next one of these, she's the one who should be on the team, right? Your sponsor is going to be the person who helps you to advance in your career. And sometimes, like I said, that's your mentor, but usually they tend to be two different individuals because you go to them for two different reasons. And where that tends to be important, specifically for people who may identify as diverse, Your sponsor often is not going to be someone who identifies from the same community as you, right? And that's not to say that that person can't be, but realistically, that's because right now a lot of the decision makers aren't necessarily diverse. And so it's important to begin to develop those relationships and what they can look like. They're going to happen in college too, right? Maybe that's the the advisor who's going to advocate for you to get into, that program that only 5 people get into, or maybe it's a professor who's going to, help you leverage your way into some sort of internship or job, whatever it may be. But start developing those relationships now, because as you move into the workplace, some of those things might evolve, right? Maybe your sponsor in college will become your mentor in your professional life, or vice versa. But if you start to really foster what that kind of relationship looks like now, as you move into a space that's no longer academic, that's a really important relationship to know how to strike up.
I like that. It's a different take on the mentor. You need to have a mentor and a sponsor. I like that. It's a good perspective. All right. So next question. Thinking about the creation of your brand, how much of a factor is thinking about the market that you want to occupy or the industry you want to go into? Like when you're in that brand development stage, how much thought should be put into trying to match some of the things that they may be looking for?
A lot. A lot. Most of your thought should go there, especially when we're talking about image creation and curation, right? But at the crux of that, or sort of at the root of that, is again this idea of not losing you, right? So just because you want to occupy space in an environment that's traditionally very corporate, right, that comes with corporate dress codes and corporate rules, doesn't mean that if you love to be a big, bold personality, that you should have to tamp that down, right? It may mean that you need to figure out how to leverage different parts of that personality to be most beneficial to you in that environment, but you shouldn't have to change, right? So yes, you want to give a lot of thought to the space it is that you're trying to occupy, to make sure that you can move fluidly within that space, but you should not have to change to do it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's great advice. I think, but at the same time, it can be easier said than done sometimes, right? I mean,
for sure, especially when you're starting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like to Glenn's point earlier, coming in as a queer person of color into an institution that isn't necessarily founded on that, but maybe opening the doors to that can be difficult at times. All right, which brings us to our next question. So, say you end up with an organization and that brand is kind of curating, or that organization's curating a brand for you that isn't necessarily the one that you're trying to curate for yourself. How would you go about approaching that kind of situation?
Sure, that's a value question. And so that depends on what you have at stake, right? And what you are willing to risk. And for everybody, that answer is really different. That's not one of those things that can come out of the box, or that I think I can answer universally, because for each person, you have to decide for you what you're comfortable with and what image you are comfortable with an organization sharing of you for you, right? That's going to vary greatly from individual to individual. Some people are going to have super strong sort of moral guiding philosophies that say, I am this, whatever this is, and that's who I am. And if you can't deal with that, then I don't want to be here. Other people are going to have no issue, right, with something being curated for them that's completely different than perhaps how they would curate for themselves. That is so individual of a discussion, but it's something that everyone needs to be thinking about, right? Because as you find yourself in these situations, know how it is you want to respond before you find yourself there, right? That sometimes can guide you even into where you accept positions, right? What kinds of roles you accept, what kind of organizations you want to be in, maybe even certain industries, might help. That can be sort of like the lead for you as to whether or not that's even a road you want to pursue. Like I said, there's not a right or wrong answer to that, because everybody's got very different personal boundaries, right? And very different comfort levels with how it's okay to be defined. But it's something that you need to be thinking about before you even find yourself in the place of having to make a choice about how you want to respond to it.
Love it. Yeah. Again, just no, just appreciate your insight on that. I think yeah, like it's never an easy situation to figure out when that is going down. It's like, do you want to go and find another organization that more closely matches what you're looking for, or do you want to stick it out and try and make some changes where you are? So I appreciate your insight on that.
Sure.
All right, so this kind of ties into the next question as well, in terms of taking risks with your brand. So where and how is it appropriate to take risks with your brand? And I guess another part that I think about is like, when is it appropriate to do so? Because I think, you have to have a certain amount of credibility to your name before you can be out here taking risks, right? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of layers to that question. Yes, you do need to have a certain level of credibility before you sort of go out on a limb. And so sometimes that can tailor into the question that we were just talking about, right? And understanding where your boundaries are and what you're comfortable with. And the conversation that we had before, where we talked about, sort of who you want to be versus maybe where you are right now. And there is a level of being able to say, if, because for everybody it's not, right? Some people might be perfectly on point with exactly the industry that they want to be a part of, right? And there may be no separation for them of image, and that's okay. Great, that's awesome. But for the folks where there is sort of that difference, right? Or you want to be something maybe, or present something a little bit different than what your industry or even, sort of where your credentials can lend you to being. I think it's really important to maybe tailor it down, whatever it is you were initially thinking about, but don't turn it off. Because if it's always off, you never have room to grow up and into what it is you want to be, right? So always allow some little bit, some little facet of whatever that thing is that you hope one day you can just let fly freely. Always allow some bit of that to show through. Right? It'll be, again, up to you where, how, when, what you do, but some piece of that, make sure that somebody finally says, like, when you decide to do whatever it is, maybe it's, I don't know, whatever. Make sure that someone, by the time that you get to the place where you have the clout to be able to do it, that people are saying finally, and they're not surprised, right? It should be like a moment of like, there it is, not a moment of like, what just happened, right? It shouldn't be like a switch flipped. And obviously I'm not talking about issues of identity or how you identify as a human. I'm talking about sort of the more superficial things that come along with what we're talking about, because I understand that some of the identity, being able to express it the way that you want to also comes from a place of privilege, right? And so it's important to acknowledge that does play into this, and that's not what I'm addressing as I make this point. But I do think that yes, you need to have some sense of industry, some sense of where you are. But the other thing that's really important to not discredit ever is lived experience, right? So credentials, obviously super important. They lend clout. They tell people that you've learned in a classroom and that you've gotten a lot of support behind you by other people who are academic and who can support that. But lived experience in a lot of cases is really important too. And it's something to note that we're mindful of that in people, especially just depending on the kind of space that they're in. So taking risk and where that can be. Again, we talked yesterday a little bit about athletes, right? There's some risk that athletes take all the time in terms of their own personal branding. Maybe somebody who's been really quiet suddenly makes a TikTok that's, sort of outlandish, and it pays off for them, right? Maybe it plays into how the team plays that week, or, the perception of, we had Juju, dancing on other teams' end zones this year, which was a bit of a cry from a couple years ago when he lost his bicycle. Evolution, right? Folks change, but again, that's the point. Always make sure that those moments are seeds, maybe that are growing, right? And that people see the potential for them to be there. It should never be something, a risk that you take should never be something that comes as a surprise, right? So be really calculated as you take them, about where you are, but never hide them entirely. That was really long-winded.
It's all good. No, I love it. I think this next question also kind of builds on that a little bit. Is there a way to kind of practice what your brand looks like, or, get a feel for it before actually going into, putting that out in the professional world? And the reason I asked that, thinking about from a career services standpoint, we have students that come in, we meet with them for resume reviews. We meet with them to help them prepare a cover letter, go through interview prep. So it's like they have a opportunity to practice and, refine that before going out and doing it in front of a professional. But
Sure.
brand, getting a feel for that on a larger scale can be a little more difficult to encompass. So is there a way to go about practicing what that looks like?
Yeah, I think a big part of your brand is how you live every day, right? It's habit. So it shouldn't be something that's inauthentic to you. It should be a part of what you are literally doing every day, right? So the practice is going to come in just what you're doing right now, right? How are you presenting to the world right now? Are you take it in simple things, right? Really, really simple, sort of micro sort of nuances about you. Are your papers late, right? For your professors? Do you show up to practice late, right? Are you the person who, if your friends invite you to a party that starts, the party's a bad example because we know those never start on time, but let's say a dinner or something, right? And it starts at 7. Are you the person who shows up at 7:30 and then is upset when everybody has, ordered drinks or started eating, whatever, right? Those are things you don't realize. You've branded yourself as the late person. Everybody knows that you're late, right? Like that is now a part of how people associate who you are. They're going to think of you as the person who's always running behind, right? Like your brand is somewhat inherent to who you are as a human. So it's already crafted. At this point, what you want to start thinking about is how you're curating it, right? So what are you going to be putting into it to change it, to shift it, right? How are you presenting yourself on social media? How are you presenting yourself with your teachers? How are you presenting yourself with your peers? When you're participating in a group project, right? What role do you have in that group project? And it's okay, whatever it is, but what role is it? Think about it. Identify what that looks like, because oftentimes you'll find that translates into the role that you may have either in the workplace or in other situations, right? There tend to be some nuances, and obviously there are exceptions, but there tend to be some nuances there that are consistent across all of those demographics, right? So you have sort of that in-person day-to-day aspect of your brand, of who you are, right? And then you have the stuff that you get to choose how the world sees, right? And that looks like Instagram. That might be Facebook. That might be your website, right? Maybe that is your blog, or if you're doing, some sort of school publication, how you present yourself through whatever that medium is, right? That's the part that you get to curate and show to the world. And so how you use that, I see we have a question that came in the box. So how you use that in an interview or when you're networking is, where are you sending people to, right? Where are you driving the traffic? So outside of just sort of the brand that is you, right? That is the daily experience of meeting you, of talking to you, where are you driving people? So if somebody says to you at a student event, oh, I think Danny, you're really fantastic and I want to work with you. Can I email you, right? Or can I check out your website? What does your email address say? Is it, Danny B at Pitt, or is it, guy in a white shirt sitting in an office at Pitt? Like what is it saying? Like, how are you driving the traffic to the places that tell people about you, right? When I land on your webpage, what's that going to look like? Is the first thing going to be a picture of your family? Is it going to be a picture of you? Is it going to be a picture of you playing sports, right? What is it? All of those things start to tell people about who you are and start to create an image for them about who they're going to be working with, right? So when networking, thinking about that, right? Where am I sending people as I tell them to contact me, to reach out further, to learn more about me? And when I send them there, what are they finding? Right? What information is there? What picture is going to be painted without me being there to narrate it for them, right? And so we want to be mindful of always thinking about that when dealing with folks and sort of using that. You know, it's a resume. Are you still using paper resumes? Are they only online resumes? What does your formatting look like? Is that consistent with what you tell people? If you say to somebody, I don't talk very much, you know, I'm quick and efficient, I like to get the job done, but then you submit a 17-page resume, those two things aren't super in alignment with one another, right? That's where I would expect a 1-pager that's maybe really brief or bulleted, and to be sort of sparse, quite frankly, with a person who self-describes that way, right? So thinking about all of those pieces and how they align with one another, and then where you're sharing that with folks, that's part of your networking and your interviewing.
Awesome. So, and you know, you mentioned Carol's question in the chat. So if we had to summarize everything, I know we talked about a lot of different things. We talked about some great examples of people practicing their brand. We talked about, you know, matching it to the space, language, aesthetics, you know, all that kind of stuff. So if you had to summarize what goes into actually crafting the brand, what would you say that is? And then, you know, any advice for how to use it going into an interview setting and networking, you know, just to leave the audience with that as we wrap things up.
Sure. So actually crafting your brand, everything about yourself that you present to the world, right? Literally from your physical person to your online presence to how you speak when somebody can't see you to how you write, all of those things are your brand, right? All of those things should be intentional. Whatever that message is okay as long as you are okay with that message, right? So that is sort of what I would think about when I'm saying how to craft it, how to use it in an interview or networking, making sure that whatever it is that we just spoke about that you crafted is authentic, is a big part of it, or at least as authentic as it can be, right? And making sure that it's something that you can sustain and maintain, right? Like those things need to be easy for you to always be. It should be less about like a thing that you put on and more about a part of who you are, right? So in an interview, if you know you are presenting yourself as somebody who's super neat in appearance and always on time and their work is great, in an interview you have to be that person, right? Continue that brand, continue that image, that picture that you have already painted. When networking, the same thing. If that's what you put forth, then that's the person who's probably going to show up with a really cool business card. It's got like some sort of cool touch feel to it, or you know, memorable moment that makes you really sort of remember them in your mind, right? Like that's consistent with that personality type. Whereas, you know, maybe if that's not what you're going for and you're a little bit more organic,